I don't really remember anything about the Beatle days. It seems like a sort of, previous incarnation.
He was the Beatle who spoke the least, but when it came to this one person, George Harrison's feelings were impossible to hide. For years, the tension simmered, turning into something much darker, something close to hatred. So who was it that George Harrison utterly despised? Join us as we uncover the truth. The making of a fighter. George Harrison's story began in one of the toughest places and times imaginable. He was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny two-bedroom house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool. His arrival into the world came on a night when the city was under its 78th straight evening of bombings during World War II. Air raid sirens, blackouts, and fear were part of everyday life for his family. Survival itself was not guaranteed, and George's parents, Harold and Louise, had little more than determination to hold on to. Money was painfully scarce in the Harrison home. Harold worked long, punishing shifts as a bus conductor, earning only about £3 a week. To stretch their budget, he often walked miles rather than pay for his own bus fare. Louise also took whatever work she could find, usually night-cleaning jobs in offices, making only a few shillings for each building she scrubbed. Their food allowance was just 15 shillings for the entire week. That meant very little meat and almost no extras. The Harrison children went to bed hungry more than once. George and his brothers even shared a single bed until he was 16. Despite these hardships, the Harrisons were not without warmth. Louise, especially, filled their modest home with a sense of hope. She believed in her children's dreams and made sacrifices to support them. Later, when George's music needed funding, she even pawned her own wedding ring to help him get an amplifier. Every penny the family had was stretched, but when it came to George's passion for music, his parents and siblings always found a way to give. That passion first struck George when he was 12 years old. One day in 1955, while riding his bike, he passed a house where Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel was playing through an open window. He stopped in his tracks, mesmerized. The sound of Elvis's voice and the echo of the guitar lit something inside him that never faded. He went home and told his mother that he needed a guitar more than he needed food. She didn't dismiss his words. She understood how serious he was. At age 14, George finally got his first guitar, a cheap Eggman flat top from Frank Hess's music shop. It cost 30 shillings, a big expense for the family. The guitar was difficult to play, and George's fingers bled as he tried to master chords, but he refused to give up. He practiced 6 to 8 hours every day, working until the pain no longer mattered. School fell to the side. His teachers wrote that he seemed to care only about guitars, not geometry, not history, not much else at all. Music had taken over every part of his mind. Fate soon introduced George to Paul McCartney. They met on the number 86 bus to Liverpool when Paul noticed George carrying his guitar. George told him he could play 20 Flight Rock, a difficult song at the time. Paul was impressed, and soon after, George auditioned for Paul's band, the Quarry Men. In front of John Lennon, he played raunchy perfectly, even though he was just a few months shy of 15. Lennon thought he was too young, but Paul pushed hard for George. His talent was undeniable, and eventually, John gave in. George became the youngest member of the group that would one day change the world. George had fought his way out of poverty and into music with sheer determination. But the battles ahead inside the band would be even harder. The little brother complex. When George Harrison first joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the age difference mattered more than most people realize. John was nearly 3 years older than George, and in the late 1950s, that gap felt huge. To John, George was still a kid tagging along. He often treated him more like a younger brother than an equal bandmate. John could be sharp and dismissive, brushing off George's opinions before they were even finished. It was clear who the leaders were, and George wasn't one of them. Paul McCartney, though friendlier than John, came with his own challenges. Paul's perfectionism in the studio became a source of tension. He had strong ideas about how every note should sound, and he often tried to control not just his own parts, but everyone else's too. George, who wanted space to develop as a guitarist and songwriter, found himself constantly corrected, directed, or even silenced. What might have been helpful guidance at the start soon became suffocating. Paul's dominance left little room for George's creativity to breathe. As the Beatles grew more successful, this imbalance only deepened. George had songs of his own, but the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership controlled the band's direction. From the very beginning, John and Paul had agreed, unspoken but understood, that they would be the main songwriters. George could contribute, but only in small amounts. For most of the Beatles' career, he was limited to 1 or 2 songs per album, no matter how many ideas he brought forward. This wasn't because he lacked material. In fact, by the mid-1960s, he had a growing pile of songs, many of which were as strong as or stronger than those written by John and Paul. The problem was simply that his voice wasn't valued in the same way. George's first attempt at songwriting came in 1963, when he was bedridden with an illness during a tour stop in Bournemouth. Out of boredom, he decided to see if he could write something of his own. The result was Don't Bother Me, which made it onto the album With the Beatles. While it wasn't a classic, it proved that George had the ability to write songs that fit the band. Still, his progress as a songwriter was slowed by the constant rejections and the sense that his contributions weren't taken seriously. Every time he tried to push forward, he was reminded that Lennon and McCartney were the ones in charge. Outside the studio, the media added to the frustration. Each Beatle was given a simple label for the public to hold on to. John was the smart one, Paul was the cute one, Ringo was the lucky one, and George became the quiet one. It wasn't just a nickname, it was a cage. Reporters and fans saw him as reserved, shy, and even withdrawn, ignoring his humor, his opinions, and his growing skill as a writer. To the world, George Harrison was a background figure, not the creative force he was becoming. Being treated like the younger sibling inside the band and erased by the media outside it left George carrying years of resentment, and soon that anger would boil over. Hamburg and hard lessons. In 1960, when George Harrison was only 17, the Beatles were sent to Hamburg, Germany. At the time, they weren't famous and the trip wasn't glamorous. It was rough, loud, and demanding. They played in small clubs where the owners wanted energy, noise, and non-stop entertainment. Each night, the Beatles were forced to play for up to 8 hours straight, with only short breaks in between. The sets dragged on until the early morning, and the band had to stretch out songs, improvise new parts, and keep the crowd interested no matter how exhausted they were. For George, who was still a teenager, it was a crash course in endurance. The living conditions in Hamburg made the work even harder. The Beatles slept in cramped, filthy spaces, often in the back of the clubs they played in. Their beds were surrounded by noise, smoke, and dirt. Privacy didn't exist, and comfort was out of the question. The Reeperbahn district, where they worked, was full of crime, alcohol, and violence. Club bouncers were tough men, some with dangerous pasts, and fights could break out without warning. George and the others had to learn quickly how to survive in that world. It wasn't just about music, it was about resilience. Despite the challenges, Hamburg shaped George as a musician in powerful ways. Night after night of endless playing gave him stamina and discipline. His fingers toughened, his timing sharpened, and his ability to improvise improved dramatically. When a set lasted hours, mistakes weren't an option. He had to stay focused and creative. Over time, he built the technical precision that later defined his style. Hamburg pushed him beyond the limits he thought he had. George also played a crucial role in shaping the Beatles' sound during this period. He and Paul added pickups to their guitars and started experimenting with amplifiers to get a louder, sharper edge. George's guitar work added aggression and drive to the band's performances, giving them the raw, electric feel that made them stand out from other groups. The long nights in Hamburg turned the Beatles into professionals, and George's growth as a guitarist was at the center of that transformation. But while the music brought the band closer together on stage, offstage the bonds weren't always equal. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were becoming a tight partnership. They were writing songs together and strengthening their creative connection. George admired them, but he wasn't part of their inner circle. He was younger and less experienced in their eyes, and was often left out of their decisions. Even though his guitar work carried their shows and gave them their distinctive sound, he still felt like the outsider of the group. Cracks in the Fab Four. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were no longer the tight group that had once taken on the world together. The friendship and excitement of the early years were giving way to constant arguments, especially between George Harrison and Paul McCartney. Their working styles clashed, and George often felt humiliated in the studio. One of the most famous examples came during the rehearsals for what became the Let It Be film. Cameras caught Paul repeatedly nitpicking George's guitar parts. Paul told him how and when to play, correcting him in front of everyone. George stayed calm at first, but the tension was clear. He wanted freedom to express himself as a guitarist, but Paul was determined to control the sound exactly the way he imagined it. That frustration kept building. A similar situation had happened earlier during the recording of Hey Jude. George tried adding guitar riffs after Paul's vocal lines. Instead of letting him experiment, Paul cut him off, saying it didn't fit. George didn't argue, but later admitted how insulting it felt. He was a skilled guitarist with years of experience, yet Paul dismissed his ideas as if they didn't matter. Then there was Maxwell's Silver Hammer, one of Paul's favorite songs, but one the rest of the band strongly disliked. Recording it turned into a nightmare. They spent 4 days and multiple takes on a track that George thought was, in his own words, fruity and pointless. Ringo Starr even called it the worst recording experience of his life. But Paul insisted, and everyone else had to go along with it. For George, it was another reminder that his opinion carried little weight compared to Paul's. The rejection of George's songwriting was even more painful. By this point, he had a large collection of strong songs, but John and Paul rarely gave them serious attention. All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity and Not Guilty were just a few examples of tracks that were laughed off or pushed aside. Later, when George released them as a solo artist, they became classics, proof that the others had underestimated him for years. The difference in approach was clear. Lennon and McCartney produced songs quickly, working almost like a factory, while George wrote with more thought and introspection. But instead of seeing this as a strength, the band treated it as a weakness. Everything came to a head on January 10, 1969, during the Get Back sessions. After another round of arguments, George quietly put down his guitar and announced he was leaving the group. He didn't yell or fight, he simply walked out. John Lennon's reaction showed just how cold things had become. He shrugged and suggested they could bring in Eric Clapton to replace George. To John, George's presence was no longer essential. George did return, but only under strict conditions. He demanded that the rehearsals move from Twickenham Studios to the more comfortable Apple Studios. He refused to take part in the live TV concert Paul wanted, and he insisted on having more chances to contribute his own songs. The fact that he had to bargain just to be respected said everything about how bad things had gotten. George's patience was running out, and soon his quiet anger would turn into something impossible to ignore. The silent genius finally speaks. For years, George Harrison had been pushed to the background while John Lennon and Paul McCartney dominated the Beatles' albums. But in 1966, something changed. On Revolver, George finally carved out space to show what he was capable of as a songwriter. The album opened with Taxman, a biting political track that complained about Britain's high tax rates. Starting the album with George's song was a statement in itself. This was not just Lennon and McCartney's band anymore. Even more surprising, George had 3 songs on the record: Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You. It was a rarity for him, and it showed he was growing more confident and more determined to be heard. But this progress did not last. The following year, the band began work on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, an album that became one of the most famous records in music history. For George, though, the experience was frustrating and isolating. He offered a new song called Only a Northern Song, which criticized the unfair way publishing rights and money were handled in the band. John and Paul rejected it, dismissing his concerns and denying him a proper spot on the record. Instead, George contributed just one song to Sgt. Pepper, The Haunting Within You Without You. It was inspired by his deepening interest in Indian music and spirituality, but when he recorded it, none of the other Beatles were involved. He worked with Indian musicians and producer George Martin, building the track without Lennon, McCartney, or Starr. It became the first Beatles song created entirely without the rest of the band. While many critics later praised it as one of George's greatest works, the truth was that at the time, his bandmates didn't even care enough to attend the sessions. To them, it was just another George song. To George, It was proof of how isolated he had become. Finally, in 1969, George reached a moment of redemption on Abbey Road. For the first time in the Beatles' career, one of his songs was treated as an equal to Lennon and McCartney's work. That song was Something. Released as a double A-side single alongside John's Come Together, it became one of the Beatles' biggest hits. Even Frank Sinatra later praised it as one of the greatest love songs ever written. John Lennon himself admitted that Something was the best track on the album. Paul, too, acknowledged its brilliance. And as George's confidence in his own voice grew, his patience with the others was wearing thin. Affairs and betrayals. For much of the 1960s, George Harrison's marriage to model Pattie Boyd looked like the perfect love story. They had met on the set of the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night and quickly fell in love. To fans, their relationship seemed glamorous and unshakable, but behind the public smiles, things were breaking apart. George's growing fame, his increasing drug use, and his emotional distance all began to erode the marriage. The collapse became even more complicated because of George's best friend, Eric Clapton. Clapton fell deeply in love with Pattie, and his obsession grew to the point where he began writing her letters and even showing up at George's home. His passion for her inspired his famous song, Layla, a cry of unfulfilled desire. At first, Pattie resisted, but George was drifting further away from her. By the mid-1970s, she finally left him and moved in with Clapton. For George, it was a double betrayal. Not only had he lost his wife, but it was to one of his closest friends. George's own behavior, however, was far from faithful. While still married to Pattie, he had numerous affairs. The most damaging came with Maureen Starkey, the wife of his fellow Beatle, Ringo Starr. George did not hide the relationship. In fact, he bluntly told Ringo about it, a move that shocked everyone around him. Pattie, meanwhile, once walked in and found George and Maureen in bed together. The discovery shattered both marriages and further strained George's friendships inside the Beatles' circle. John Lennon was especially disgusted, later describing the situation as virtual incest. These betrayals revealed a darker side of George's personal life. While he often spoke about peace, love, and spirituality, his private behavior told another story. By the early 1970s, George was deeply involved in heavy drug use, particularly cocaine. He smoked heavily, drank, and indulged in a lifestyle that clashed with the spiritual image he had carefully built around his devotion to Indian philosophy and meditation. And soon, George would step into the spotlight on his own terms, with an album that proved he had been underestimated all along. Contradictions of a Spiritual Rock Star. George Harrison is remembered as the spiritual Beatle, the one who looked beyond fame and searched for something deeper. But his life was full of contradictions. For all his devotion to meditation, prayer, and Indian philosophy, he often slipped into the very temptations he preached against. The clash between his ideals and his behavior defined much of his post-Beatles life. His journey began in the mid-1960s with a life-changing event, his first LSD trip. It wasn't planned. A dentist secretly slipped the drug into George's and John Lennon's coffee during a party. The experience was overwhelming. George later said that from that night on, he saw the world differently. It opened his mind to the idea that life wasn't just about money and fame. It was about finding higher truth. LSD led him toward Indian music, sitar lessons with Ravi Shankar, and eventually the teachings of Hinduism and the Hare Krishna movement. But while the spiritual search was genuine, George struggled with the darker side of drugs. In the 1970s, after the Beatles had broken up, his cocaine use became heavy. He also chain-smoked and drank more than he admitted publicly. His health began to suffer, yet he kept going. The contradiction was obvious. He was warning others about ego and indulgence while still indulging himself. At one point, he even told Elton John to stay away from cocaine, even though George himself was still hooked. His friends saw it as hypocrisy, though it was also a sign of how torn he was between two versions of himself. Another contradiction came with his relationship to wealth. George often sang about the emptiness of materialism. His solo album, Living in the Material World, was a direct statement about how money and fame distracted from spiritual growth. But George himself lived in one of the most extravagant homes in England, Friar Park, a 120-room Victorian mansion surrounded by sprawling gardens and lakes. He collected luxury cars, had relationships with models and actresses, and enjoyed the benefits of rock star life. To outsiders, it seemed he was preaching one thing while living another. The truth was more complex. George genuinely believed that material things didn't bring happiness, yet he also loved beauty, comfort, and the freedom that money gave him. He could sit in meditation one moment and then jump into a sports car the next. He didn't see himself as a saint. He saw himself as someone caught between two worlds, freedom and fury, after the Beatles. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, many wondered how George Harrison would fare on his own. For years he had been treated as the junior partner, the one allowed only a song or two per album. But once free from Lennon and McCartney's control, George exploded with creativity. The result was All Things Must Pass, a triple album that stunned the music world. Most of the songs had been written during his time with the Beatles, but rejected by John and Paul. Now, given space, George revealed just how strong his backlog of material really was. Tracks like My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, and the title song carried both spiritual depth and raw emotion. The album was a massive commercial and critical triumph, outselling solo releases by Lennon and McCartney at the time. For George, it was proof he had always been more than the quiet background figure people thought he was. He had been underestimated, and now the world knew it. Not long after, George organized one of the boldest events of the era, the Concert for Bangladesh in 1971. With Ravi Shankar, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and other stars, it was the first major benefit concert in rock history. The goal was to raise money and awareness for refugees during the Bangladesh Liberation War. While the concert itself was a powerful statement of compassion, the finances became tangled in tax problems and legal disputes, delaying much of the aid. Even so, it set the model for later events like Live Aid, showing that musicians could use their fame to make real change. Despite his success, George still carried anger toward Paul McCartney. He made that clear in several ways. He played slide guitar on John Lennon's infamous How Do You Sleep, a song that viciously attacked Paul after the breakup. George's decision to take part spoke volumes about where his loyalties lay. He also sided with John and Ringo during the legal battles that followed the breakup, openly opposing Paul in court. The bond that had once united them as teenagers from Liverpool seemed permanently broken. In interviews through the 1970s and beyond, George rarely hid his contempt for Paul. He often described Paul as controlling, selfish, and difficult to work with. Even in the 1980s and 1990s, when they occasionally collaborated, the old wounds never fully healed. George could be polite in public, but privately he still carried resentment from the years of being overshadowed and dismissed. This mix of freedom and fury defined George's life after the Beatles. On one hand, he had proven himself as a solo artist, building a career that stood proudly next to Lennon and McCartney's. On the other, he never escaped the bitterness left behind by the band's collapse. The Beatles had given him everything, and also left him with scars he carried for the rest of his life. And as George moved further into the 1980s, new struggles would test both his health and his spirit. Final years of conflict. By the late 1980s, George Harrison was a man caught between recognition and resentment. In 1988, the Beatles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have been a triumphant, celebratory night. Instead, it revealed just how fractured the relationships had become. Paul McCartney refused to attend, unwilling to face the legal disputes that were still simmering between him and the others. Ringo Starr showed up but was noticeably drunk. That left George to deliver the acceptance speech mostly on his own. Ever diplomatic in public, he kept his words brief and professional, but underneath the calm tone, the tension was clear. What should have been a moment of unity instead reminded the world of how deeply divided the Beatles remained. Even after that night, George's resentment toward Paul never fully faded. In interviews, he often made sharp remarks about Paul's personality and music. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes direct, but the bitterness from their years in the studio lingered right up until George's last days. With John Lennon, the situation was even more painful. When John was murdered in 1980, George had not fully reconciled with him. They had worked together less in the final years of the Beatles, and George admitted to feeling like Lennon never gave him the respect he deserved. The loss was made heavier by the fact that George never got to clear the air, or repair the bond they had once shared. While these old wounds never fully healed, George's greatest battles in his final years were not with his former bandmates, but with his own body. In the 1990s, he was diagnosed with cancer. He underwent treatment, but his years of heavy smoking had taken a toll. Just as he was fighting for his health, tragedy struck again. In December 1999, an intruder broke into his Friar Park home and stabbed him multiple times. George's wife Olivia fought off the attacker and likely saved his life, but the assault left both physical and emotional scars. For a man who had long searched for peace, violence had literally invaded his sanctuary. As his health declined in the early 2000s, George leaned more and more into his spiritual practices. Surrounded by family, friends, and members of the Hare Krishna movement, he spent his final days meditating and chanting. True to his lifelong search, his last recorded words were, "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait." It was a fitting final message for a man who had spent his life torn between two worlds. The rock star lifestyle filled with wealth, conflict, and indulgence, and the inner journey toward peace and God. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His life was a story of brilliance and contradiction, of deep wounds and spiritual longing. He left behind music that continues to inspire, but also a reminder of how even the most gifted souls carry struggles to the very end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more music history.